This is the AWS Morning Brief Security Edition. AWS is fond of saying security is job zero. That means it's nobody in particular's job, which means it falls to the rest of us. Just the news you need to know, none of the fluff.
Hello and welcome to Last Week in AWS Security Edition. Let's get right into it. CloudFlare had a confused deputy vulnerability that allowed the reporter to view sensitive information about other customers, Microsoft, and GitHub organizations. This is, needless to say, not terrific. That said, a confused deputy vulnerability very often turns me into a confused DevOps professional. So for those who, like me, aren't sure what that means, the short version is that you're deputizing CloudFlare, in this case, to do certain things on your behalf within GitHub. The confusion part comes in when the CloudFlare thing gets confused about which customer it's working for or what its current context is and inadvertently performs actions on behalf of a different actor. This is directionally what the term means. No user actions required in this specific case, and good on everyone involved. As I move away from IAM Identity Center toward a different source of truth, I find it interesting that a lot of folks I respect are doing very similar things. I like IAM Identity Center as an integration, but not as the identity source of truth. It's too siloed in the larger context of all the nonsense that your staff logs into. And I was going to drag this otherwise awesome article because when I first encountered it last week, it had a horribly clickbaity title. However, between the time I found it and the time I wrote the newsletter, which then became this podcast, they updated it to a much more descriptive title, disclosing the vulnerability that they located within the AWS CDK's EKS.cluster component. Good on them. Why am I harping on this? Because in the world of security, you've absolutely got to be level-headed and not prone to histrionics. When you erode reader trust, either as a vulnerability reporter or as a company, it bites you hard. That goes for you, too. If you think you found a security issue, don't report it speaking in definite terms unless you are very freaking sure. Because if you're wrong, you sound like an absolute crank. Every actual security vulnerability report I've ever made has been framed with, I'm seeing something I don't understand that might have security implications. Because sometimes I'm wrong. This framing means that I'm not accusing the vendor of anything untoward, and I'm able to speculate without impugning my own credibility. That's important, because careers are long and reputations linger.
Tailscale SSH is a new and arguably better way to SSH. Once you've enabled Tailscale SSH on your server and user devices, Tailscale takes care of the rest, so you don't need to manage, rotate, or distribute new SSH keys every time someone on your team leaves. Pretty cool, right? Tailscale gives each device in your network a node key to connect to your VPN, then uses that same key for SSH authorization and encryption. So basically, you're SSHing the same way you're already managing your network. So what's the benefit? Well, built-in key rotation, the ability to manage permissions as code, connectivity between any two devices, and reduced latency. You can even ask users to re-authenticate SSH connections for that extra bit of security to keep the compliance folks happy. Try Tailscale now. It's free forever for personal use.
From AWS, they announced that AWS KMS now supports importing asymmetric and HMAC keys. While I'm generally a fanatical cultist when it comes to the church of private keys never leave the machine upon which they were generated, I can appreciate that this makes migrating workloads to AWS, or let's face it, between AWS accounts in some instances, have one fewer speed bump along the way. Therefore, I begrudgingly admit that this is a good feature, and I fear that I've just been named an apostate. And the tool tip of the week is this list of documented and undocumented AWS API models is an absolute goldmine as far as what's possible yet not officially supported in AWS land. Of course, the security implications are non-trivial. And that's what happened last week in AWS security. I'm cloud economist Corey Quinn. Stay salty.
Thank you for listening to the AWS Morning Brief Security Edition. For the latest in AWS security that actually matters, please follow AWS Morning Brief on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever the hell it is you find the dulcet tones of my voice, and be sure to sign up for the Last Week in AWS newsletter at lastweekinaws.com.